Hi, it's Fraser here. And before we get into this week's Spiked podcast, I just wanted to let you know about a fantastic event we're organising. Lionel Shriver will be joining Brendan O'Neill live for a special recording of his podcast next week. Lionel and Brendan will be live on Zoom on October the 11th at 7 p.m, and they'll be taking your questions too. This event is free, but it's exclusive to Spiked supporters. So if you're a Spiked supporter, why not sign up now via the Spiked Supporters Hub on the Spiked website? If you're not a Spiked supporter yet, then why not sign up today? You can sign up for as little as £5 a month or £50 a year, and you can get access to this event, plus a whole load of other supporter perks. You can sign up today by going to spiked-online.com/supporters. That's spiked-online.com/supporters. Don't miss Lionel Shriver and Brendan O'Neill live on Tuesday, the 11th of October at 7 p.m. See you there. Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and back with me we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And no Ella Whelan this week, and not for a while in fact, as she's on maternity leave. But in her place, we're delighted to welcome friend of the show and Spiked columnist Inaya Folarin Iman.
Hi.
Coming up on today's show, the implosion of the Tories, the protests in Iran, and Elon Musk's deal to buy Twitter is back on. So the Conservative Party has had its conference this week. Obviously, there's been a lot more attention paid to what's going outside the conference room, particularly in the markets, and perhaps even more shockingly in the polls, where we've seen, some 33-point leads for Labour, Liz Truss's personal popularity tanking. I mean, Tom, what have you made of this?
I think the prevailing sense you get is of a historic opportunity that's been well and truly squandered. I think it's fair to say. I mean, it does feel like the stench of death is overwhelming. I mean, listening to Liz Truss's speech, the words almost kind of float past you, not just because they're a little bit odd and strangely delivered in places, but also because of the fact that the whole project feels very much spent. That brief period in which they really sort of channeled that Brexity energy into something that felt genuinely quite interesting and potentially could do the unthinkable and give them maybe a fifth term in office, has gone. They've reverted to this sort of effigy of Margaret Thatcher rendered in damp flannel. It's a really unattractive and, as we've noticed in these polls, not democratically supported kind of programme. I think Matt Goodwin was pointing this out recently, that kind of quote unquote liberal lever or neoliberal lever, however you want to put it, version of Brexit has never been more even kind of charitably like 20% of the electorate. And yet it now runs the country without a democratic mandate. And aside from the kind of exhaustion of the Tories at this point, they've been in office for a long time and they have been battered by their own kind of failures and scandals, is also a good reminder of what happens when you take voters for granted.
Yeah.
More than anything else, I think that's the prevailing message at this point.
Yeah, because it's, Liz Truss, not only did she seek a kind of democratic mandate from the electorate after changing the leadership, she's trying to change the direction of economic policy without, talking to the public, without even explaining a lot of her ideas to the public.
No, I think that is a kind of key fundamental point. It's not that the public are averse to experimentation and trying new things. It's the way in which they've been excluded from the conversation with such a different direction to the historic mandate that was handed to the Conservatives in 2019. And I think it does really reveal just the kind of dearth of talent and dearth of ideas amongst the political class, because the mandate that was given, it could not really have been more clear cut. An 80-seat majority, as Tom mentioned, really harnessing the opportunities of Brexit and using it to transform the country, particularly parts of the country that had been neglected, so to speak, for decades. And that has been, unfortunately, squandered. And I think it is being revealed increasingly in the polls. And I think, Liz Truss is not a stupid woman. She came in there with her eyes open. She knew that she was, there was very high expectations. She was inheriting a very challenging situation around the pandemic and the energy crisis. And she thought that she could kind of go back to the same, Tory psychodrama and all the simple things that they often get themselves into without going to the public. And I just think that was incredibly, incredibly naive.
And Tom, it's interesting looking at some of the polls that it is in those red wall seats where Liz Truss seems to be failing even worse than in general terms.
No, completely. And, these things might settle down. I think there's a tendency to kind of look at what's going on at the moment.
Yeah.
A moment of kind of profound media hysteria in relation to what happened in the past week, as well as, let's face it, kind of rubbing of hands that the Tory era is over and to kind of overstate where we are. But it does seem like the damage has been badly done. I mean, Boris Johnson really damaged his own standing in a lot of those constituencies anyway. But the kind of polling deficits you're talking about now are crazy. I mean, Liz Truss just across the country is now more unpopular than Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson, who are two very divisive figures. And I think that even though we might say that she's in some respects the kind of victim of events, it doesn't get away from the fact that what those voters signed up to, this is in many respects the kind of polar opposite of it. In so far as Boris Johnson's great insight, aside from recognising that Brexit had to be implemented, and that was a pretty important thing, was also that part of the electorate which was up for grabs, which had been ignored for so long, might have had some kind of kinship with the Conservatives on Brexit, on certain culture war issues and so on, that they weren't Thatcherites. These are parts of the country in which Thatcher is still an epithet to a certain extent. So to kind of not only just revert back to this, but to do so, as Inaya was saying, with no kind of argument whatsoever, with no attempt to lay out your programme, it was of course going to doom them to failure. And I think this is something which I'm amazed that they didn't really see this coming in that respect.
Aren't you just part of the Antigrowth Coalition by saying
Who isn't part of the Antigrowth Coalition? That's what
it seems to be everyone. Yeah.
I have to say that's the worst, most cumbersome coinage that
but it's also just very bizarre. I mean, I'm very pro-growth. We want, more development, more prosperity across the country. But the idea that there is this kind of very narrow way to pursue that, and if you don't support that, then you're, vindictive against Liz Truss, I just don't think is very true. But I also just worry about the impact this is going to have on our democracy more broadly. We mentioned the Red War, who had, taken an opportunity, many people for the first time in a generation, to vote the Conservatives, and it hasn't produced anywhere near the kinds of hopes that people wanted. And now Labour are increasing in the polls, not because they have this kind of radical transformative programme, which means we all want to really support them, just because the options are so, bad, really. And it has become a kind of trite point, or the lesser of two evils. But actually, it is a bad sign for our democracy.
Well, people deserve better than that,
Absolutely.
don't they?
Yeah. And a lot of people go back to not voting. That's the other thing. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the kind of people who lent their votes to the Conservatives now moving back towards the Labour Party. I'm sure that's true in part. I mean, I think we're in a very volatile environment, and that kind of switching is going to be a part of the political landscape for a long time, I think. Which is why you can't take people for granted. But also, the thing that really made the difference, both with the Brexit revolt and then the Boris Johnson election, was people who, during the kind of tail end of the new Labour years, stopped voting. They realised that politics was no longer speaking to them almost explicitly. It was all about chasing the sort of, middle classes and all the rest of it. And they checked out, and then they slowly kind of reappeared. They started voting for UKIP, they voted for Brexit, and then many of them ended up voting Tory in 2019, or some of them 2017. And it's those people who, in my view, quite likely to just fall off the map again, which is a really bad thing. The great thing about that whole process was that those voters made themselves matter, and those areas made themselves matter. I mean, with Keir Starmer, you see that you recognise he has to respond to this in some way, shape or form, but in quite a tokenistic fashion, I think it's fair to say.
Is there anything Liz Truss can do? Is she just doomed, do you think, Inaya?
That is an interesting question, because whilst, I'm very critical of how the last few weeks have gone, at the end of the day, a few months ago, Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister, and things do seem to change. And I do think that there are a lot of moving parts. And I mean, her idea is that it's kind of short-term pain for long-term gain, and that we're going to reap the benefits of a lot of these tough decisions, so to speak, that are being made
You'll
now.
Enjoy the harsh medicine.
Exactly, which is patronising. But I think that it remains to be seen whether that will be the case, but it seems incredibly unlikely for a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who, frankly, aren't very known to the public, and what they do know seems that they don't really like, to be able to turn that around within the next year and a half. I mean, I've heard from some Conservatives that what they're hoping is, even if she can at least turn it around to an extent where the defeat isn't so disastrous, so they're not relegated to the fringes for the best part of, a decade and a half. But that's not really good enough, is it?
High hopes indeed. And the breakdown of the Tory party as well was so fascinating. I mean, you saw it at this conference as well, where you had even cabinet ministers just sort of freelancing, whether it was Penny Mordaunt on the question of whether or not benefits should rise in line with inflation, or on the other side, Suella Braverman talking about how dropping the U-turn, the U-turn was essentially a coup, and that if anything, she wanted migration down to the tens of thousands, which certainly grates against the more sort of liberal approach that Liz Truss wants to take. You're really struck by the fact that this party is so hollowed out. I mean, it has so little kind of coherence. Every member of parliament is almost like a party of one jostling for position, and obviously it's a government which feels like it's in its dying days, and all sorts of crazy things will happen naturally. But I think it does speak to the fact that these parties, because they're not kind of rooted in a particular constituency in society, even the Tory party, very given to infighting, is even more given to infighting. There's nothing kind of cohering it. And the thing that was kind of offered to them that might give it that coherence, which is this new base, this new project, this new kind of direction in which they were taking the country, it was only ever really embraced in a transactional fashion by many of them. They thought Boris Johnson can win us the election. A lot of them didn't really necessarily believe in it. A lot of them felt quite uncomfortable, I think, with these voters that they found themselves lumbered with. And all of that's now coming out in the wash, I think. And it's just going to get even messier, it feels like, from here.
Shaving with Harry's has been a real game changer for me. I've been using Harry's for over a month now, and there's no turning back. Harry's specially designed 5-blade cartridge and the razor's carefully weighted handle are exactly what you need for a close, comfortable shave. For the first time ever, I can finally get a great shave without any skin irritation. And while I often find that shaving gel can dry out my skin, Harry's has a rich, lathering gel which keeps my face feeling fresh. And that's not all. Harry's has some fantastic skincare products on top of that. For instance, if you get a Harry's trial pack, you'll get its fantastic hydrating night lotion for free. It's just one great example of the brilliant range of skincare products Harry's has to offer. Basically, Harry's just makes looking my best effortless. And by having a subscription to Harry's, I never have to worry about forgetting to buy any shaving gear. Plus, if I want to adjust or switch up any of the products I get sent, I can always make changes directly from my account page. Once you start shaving with Harry's, you'll never look back. So don't miss out. Get yourself a Harry's trial set today. And as a Spiked podcast listener or viewer, you can get yours for free. So support our podcast and start your own skincare journey by redeeming your Harry's trial set today. All you have to cover is £3.95 for the delivery. Just head to harrys.com/spiked to have your Harry's trial set and free night lotion delivered to your door. That's harrys.com/spiked. So let's talk about the protests in Iran. We've had several weeks of protests now. Over 130 people have been killed in the process, over 1,500 arrests. Tom, this is now a lot bigger than just the hijab when it started, isn't it?
Yeah, I think from quite early on, actually, you saw that this morphed into a general sort of anti-regime sentiment. You would see, obviously, the slogan of the protest being women or woman, depending on how you translate it, life, freedom, this kind of, originally a kind of Kurdish liberation slogan, which has been repeated in Farsi across the country, very much focused on the kind of question of the hijab, but also death to dictator and this kind of rumbling discontent, which has been going on sort of from late 2017 onwards, where you've had a series of protests. You've had the kind of anti-hijab movement flaring up from time to time, but also just general rejection of the regime in the context of spiraling prices, and again, people feeling like they've got no particular future, and the sense in which the elites they're becoming more authoritarian at precisely the same time that they're failing them on every conceivable measure, and just things getting towards breaking point. That being said, obviously it's impossible to underplay the role of those anti-hijab protesters. Cool. And also the symbolism of it, I think, is quite important. I mean, the Ayatollah, the founder of the Islamic Republic, said that, if this revolution achieves nothing other than making women wear the hijab, then it'll have been a success. Because it's symbolism as the kind of the imposition of the regime on people's lives can't be understated. I think, there's stories about after the revolution, people going out on the streets, supporters of the regime, handing out these gift-wrapped headscarves, So the symbolism of it, I think, is really crucial. But as you say, it's gotten much bigger than that particular issue at this point.
And Inaya, the fact that the hijab is associated with Islam to many people, does that make it? Do you think that's made it trickier for people in the West to talk about it in like a forthright way to almost fully back these protests?
I think that is possibly true. I mean, what has kind of transpired over the last few weeks has just been a demonstration of extraordinary bravery and courage, and it is really remarkable and throws, into sharp relief a lot of the debates that we're having here around freedom and so on. And I think that there are very few kind of international issues that are quite clear-cut moral issues. These women are effectively, fighting for their rights to be treated with dignity and basic humanity. And it's also been amazing to see many men joining the protests as well. And the fact that there has been this reluctance or equivocation amongst a lot of the commentariat within Western societies has been really striking. And I do think it is to do with Islam and the kind of sensitivity around discussing issues like that. But this to me is a clear-cut issue of solidarity and women's rights, and they deserve to get as much international support as possible.
And I've seen some people on social media try and downplay it by comparing it to France and their, anti-burqa laws, essentially, which are nothing like this kind of imposition. I mean, Tom, what have you made of that?
No, exactly. I think there's a lack of recognition of how oppressive this environment is, and also how much more oppressive it's gotten in recent years. The sort of Islamist regime in Iran is of a very kind of, despite its sort of traditionalist posture, it's of a very kind of modern ilk, in many respects. And it's been getting more and more authoritarian in recent years. It was only in 2005 that the morality police, who enforced these dress codes very strictly, was enforced. Since the new president came in last year, who sort of triumphed in a rigged election, has made a kind of point of really enforcing this. And back in August, they published like a 115-page document laying out the particular policy. It's really, really extreme. And as a result of that renewed clampdown, you're seeing things happen like what happened to Mahsa Amini, which was that not only is this kind of day-to-day oppressive, but also people's lives hang in the balance as a consequence of this.
Yeah.
And I think it's just moments like this do kind of remind you that whilst the West has its problems with freedom and all the rest of it, and we are in a situation where these protests almost put us to shame insofar as we're so preoccupied with, or at least our elites are, with the downsides of freedom. Freedom's being eroded, women's rights being eroded as well, which is in a kind of woke fashion, which we talk a lot about. It is still the kind of air we breathe. And as soon as it's taken away, how stultifying and suffocating that is, and you're seeing that kind of visceral reaction to it now. The question is what happens from here, of course. Which is very uncertain. There's fears you get a repeat of what happened in 2019 when like 1,500 people were killed in the midst of those fuel price protests. But at the same time, you can't get away from the moral force of this particular moment. It's really quite powerful.
Yeah, I don't want to make a kind of typical cultural point, but I do think it does put these things into perspective.
Yeah.
When you see women advocating and risking their lives, quite frankly, for basic dignity, and the discussions around women within our societies are preoccupied with some of the most trivial things, to even contesting the definition of woman as a whole. And I do think that means that a lot of the discussion has been hollowed out, that many activists don't have the ability to really articulate a defense of freedom and democracy and kind of female dignity, because the language has been so confused over the last decade.
They can't say what a woman is in straight terms,
I suppose that the one thing that concerns me going forward is the thing that has done it for a lot of sort of uprisings that we've seen in recent years, particularly to the lesson of the Arab Spring, I think, which is that one of the things that makes these protests so powerful is also the thing that makes it so vulnerable, insofar as it's really kind of sudden. It will erupt over social media, fueled by social media. You'll see it spring up in all kinds of cities at once because of how quickly that, a kind of a slogan or a message can get around and all the rest of it. But that quite self-consciously sort of leaderless, social media driven sort of protest movement, it has time and again sort of failed to be able to be durable enough, have that kind of sense of structure, have that sense of ideological coherence, which allows for them to actually advance on their particular aims, which in this case, in terms of things people are chanting and saying, is nothing short of overturning the Islamic regime. And that's one thing which is, you just hope that those kind of lessons of recent history are going to be learned at some point. But I don't think that should dampen anyone's enthusiasm for what's going on, because, you never know when when history is really going to be made, if you like, and we should all be hopeful that it does in this case.
Before we get into the next section of the Spiked podcast, I just wanted to let you know about another exciting event. The Battle of Ideas is taking place on the 15th and 16th of October, and Spiked is going to be there. If you don't know about the Battle of Ideas, it's an unmissable event. It's all about debate, politics. It's got free speech at the heart of it. It brings together speakers from across the political spectrum, speakers you'll know and recognize and love. And it has such a huge range of topics that you'll be able to debate and really get stuck in with, because audience participation is a really huge aspect of the festival. And on Saturday, we'll be doing a live edition of this podcast with me, Tom Slater, special guests Inaya, Folarin, Iman, Paul Embry, and Andrew Doyle. So don't miss it. Elsewhere in the festival, I'll be speaking on identity politics, Tom will be speaking on populism, and there will be loads of your favourite Spike writers speaking across a whole range of subjects. Plus, if you're a Spike supporter, you can get a discounted ticket. Just log in to the supporters hub on the Spiked website. For everyone else, go straight to the Battle of Ideas website, which is battleofideas.org.uk. That's one word, battleofideas.org.uk. See you there. So Elon Musk's bid to buy Twitter is back on. $44 billion he has offered to buy the social media site, and they have accepted. Now, there's been wobbles before, concerns about fake accounts and things like that. But assuming it goes through, Tom, this is potentially some okay, goodish news.
Yeah, in a guarded way. I mean, I don't think anyone should expect Elon Musk to be the sort of saviour of online freedom.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of the stink that he's caused by even trying to do this, has flushed out the problem as far as all these people at Twitter saying they're going to resign en masse and horrified at the prospect of it becoming basically as free as it was in about 2015, which seems to be about the extent of his ambitions, really. Get Trump back on there, calm down on the censorship, that kind of thing. The pearl clutching that has unleashed has been quite instructive. And I think even just sort of mixing things up in that space could be potentially quite interesting. I don't want the state of online freedom to just rest on which billionaire owns what. Yeah. But at the same time, I think in that limited sense, it's something to celebrate, definitely.
I think you're right. Flushing the people out was a a good thing in and of itself. To hear people say that they think free speech or even just slightly more free speech means the arrival of white supremacy, for instance, as many people said, is just shows you where we're at least.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do think going forward, we perhaps do need to seriously explore more democratic ways of running many of these companies, just because, as Elon Musk has admitted himself, they do often and increasingly function as a form of public square. I mean, I think it's open for discussion, debate, what that looks like going forward. But if we are going to have one billionaire running it, we would, I assume, prefer to have somebody that is more on the free speech side. And I think it is really telling, the reaction that we've received to the fact that someone is just making basic free speech arguments. Yeah. And it really does reveal that many of the more conservative concerns that it was biased or is biased against them in terms of the way that different voices are censored and so on. And many people are seemingly fearful of the fact that, their views won't be prioritized in the public debate unfairly. I mean, the only thing I would have sympathy with, I do remember a few years ago, looking at figures like Hillary Clinton's mentions, and it was all a bunch of QAnon people basically accusing her of being a Satanist. I can imagine.
Those are the 3 days.
Yeah. I do think that is might be a bit irritating for their part, but he does talk about the fact that he wants to get rid of bots and all these kinds of things. So maybe that's something that I have a bit of sympathy for those people. But overall, I think it's a good thing if we want to have more free speech.
I think that's one thing which has happened time and again, which is people, where they could just focus on maybe improving the user experience. Yeah. It becomes a conversation about who should we ban in all circumstances.
Exactly.
And all the rest of it. It's like a lot of the kind of trolling campaigns that happen, just looking at them, and they're weird, always got 8 digits or whatever it handles. These are not real people most of the time. That's why you should just block them and ignore them in most cases, regardless of the sort of bile that they're spewing. So, but that has been a big part of the problem, I think, is that people, it's just because of the way in which Twitter's set up, it's very easy to be confronted by that kind of stuff. And it's very easy to be affronted by that kind of stuff, and then demand that as a consequence, everyone you dislike should be kicked off of it and the world is going to hell in a handcart as a consequence. So, it's not to say that things shouldn't be improved and all the rest of it, but it can't be in this situation in which a handful of people, particularly because a lot of these companies act in concert. That's why the Musk thing is kind of interesting, because it would disrupt that to a certain extent.
Yeah, usually if you're banned on Twitter, you're banned on Facebook.
Yeah, that
and
kind
more
of
recently banned
happens
on bloody PayPal too.
Exactly, and that would disrupt that, which would be quite interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, it would be very interesting to see how far their kind of libertarian defense goes, because they were all saying, "Oh, well, you can just make your own social media company or whatever. But, now that Elon Musk is taking over, surely they should be happy about it's following the same logic.
It's the left-wing defense of property rights that always comes out whenever you say there should be more free speech on social media.
I mean, it does expose that the fragility of that kind of devil's bargain that the left made with these billionaires. What if one you don't like takes over? And this is what's happening.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.